morning, everybody. Welcome to the Progressive American. I'm Connor, back with another morning podcast about the week's news from a progressive perspective. Welcome back to the show. It is July 31st, 2021, and in this episode we will be discussing Biden's infrastructure plan, the controversy surrounding Simone Biles, the DOJ's warning against voter suppression by the states, Biden's recent attempts to expand vaccination efforts, and the January 6th Commission investigation. With that out of the way, let's get into the news. On Wednesday, the New York Times reported that the Senate approved the Biden administration's bipartisan infrastructure deal, with 17 Republicans defying their party leadership to bring it to the floor to a vote. The vote, which was 62 to 37, is a victory for the administration, which has at times struggled to enact its ambitious agenda. The bill is supported by both Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. In its current form, the $1 trillion bill provides $550 billion for roads, bridges, rail, and other forms of infrastructure. If passed, this bill would be the largest infusion of federal money into the public works system in more than a decade, according to the New York Times. Breaking down the exact spending, the Times reported that the bill provides $110 for roads, bridges, and major projects, $66 billion for passenger, freight, and rail, $39 billion for public transit, $65 billion for broadband, $17 billion for ports and waterways, and $46 billion to help states and cities prepare for droughts, wildfires, flooding, and all other sorts of consequences related to climate change. Describing the news of its approval, President Biden said that neither side got everything they wanted in this deal, but that's what it means to compromise and forge consensus, the heart of democracy. As the deal goes to the entire Senate, there is still plenty of work ahead to bring this home. There will be disagreements to resolve and more compromise to forge along the way, unquote. Despite his optimistic tone, Biden still faces numerous hurdles to get over. For one, Democratic Senator Kirk Sinema of Arizona has stated that while she intends to support the bipartisan deal, she refuses to support Bernie Sanders' $3.5 trillion bill that Democrats have promised to pass through reconciliation. In doing so, she has thrown the negotiations into fury, as progressives are now worried that their more ambitious plan, which the Biden administration has signaled support for, may be under threat. This could mean that the Progressive Caucus may turn against the bipartisan deal, if only to force Sinema's hand, putting it at greater risk. If this were Joe Manchin, I would understand this position, but Kyrsten Sinema is in a state that has increasingly shown a willingness to vote for more progressive and democratic policies. This continued obstructionism from her is less about pragmatism and more like a vain attempt to appear moderate when everyone knows that her future as a political activist lies with the Democratic Party. She's not leaving anytime soon. John Marshall at Talking Points Memo made a very salient point about this in his recent post, which I highly recommend you all read. In it, he argues that Sinema, unlike Manchin, is a destructive force to Democratic interests and that her egotistical refusal to do what needs to be done for her party and the country merits a primary against her. This is particularly notable because Marshall has generally been opposed to primarying members of the party. Her antics, according to Marshall, put her fellow Democrat Mark Kelly in a harder position in his hopes for re-election in 2022, and he argues that that alone merits a reason to go after her. However, if possible, Democrats should find a way around her, according to that blog post. Now, there's no guarantee that Democrats keep their seats in Arizona, and it could be risky to primary her if there isn't a successful alternative. What matters now is getting Manchin to budge and to push Sinema into supporting the bill and playing hardball. Biden should get both of these two into his office and be blunt. Fall in line or get out. There's no alternative at this point. On Tuesday, the gymnastics star and famous Olympian Simone Biles announced that she would be withdrawing from the team finals to deal with her mental health, warning that her mind was not in the right place to perform the high-stakes maneuvers that the competition requires. The reception to her decision has been largely positive, with support from some like fellow Olympian Max Whitlock, who tweeted, "You've pushed boundaries time and time again. Rest up and take time." However, some have risen to condemn her in the worst ways possible. Charlie Kirk, the right-wing founder of Turning Points USA, had his thoughts on his show.
So Simone Biles, who's obviously a very talented gymnast, decided not to compete in the gold medal competition. Now, she probably could have just competed and just kind of checked the boxes and they would have got a gold medal. Simone Biles says, "This Olympic Games, I wanted to be for myself when I came in, and I felt like I was still doing it for other people," as she cried after the team event on Tuesday. So that just, it like hurts my heart because doing what I love has been kind of taken away from me to please other people. Yeah, that's the point, Simone Biles. You're representing your nation, you're selfish sociopath. You kidding me? Today it's like, you know what? I'm not going to do something stupid and get hurt. It's just not worth it, especially when you have like 3 amazing athletes that can step up to the plate and do it. So you know who has the gold medal? Russia. Russia. I have to go look at these 4'11" Russian Olympians chewing on their gold medals, smirking at the Americans. I'm not okay with that. But honestly, that's where we're headed. We are raising a generation of weak people like Simone Biles.
The idea that a person can't step back for a moment for their own good is beyond absurd. Simone Biles, as much as her decision precipitated this, is not the issue here. Human dignity and mental health care are. More specifically, how some seem incapable of understanding human empathy when it's needed the most. If a person is looking inward and realizes that the stress of what they are doing is a hindrance to their safety, then they have every right, and I mean every right, to withdraw themselves. If anything, our ability to accommodate our athletes and support them in difficult times is more indicative of the greatness of our nation than any gold medal. It's also worth noting that none of these guys have ever said something like this about previous athletic legends like Michael Jordan, who left his basketball career after his father was killed. If this standard had been applied to Michael Jordan and others, then they would all be considered sociopaths by Kirk's floundering position. As sad as it is to admit, the truth about this is that it is almost entirely due to misogyny and a complete disregard for mental health. If a woman steps back for her mental health, she is considered selfish and a sociopath. If a man made that decision, do you honestly believe that they would receive such levels of abuse? For far too long, women have had their emotions dealt with in such a dismissive and flippant way that it is insulting. Women have been consistently seen as more hysterical or crazed than men to the point that their perspectives are not given even the slightest bit of respect, irrespective of their validity. I don't want to make this personal, but it seems that people like Charlie Kirk forget that they would not exist to speak their putrid idiocy if it were not for women. It's high time that people start to recognize that maybe, just maybe, we have a problem with how women express themselves. And maybe, just maybe, we should re-examine why and do something about it. On Thursday, President Biden announced his new efforts to ramp up vaccination in the face of the new Delta variant. During his speech, he advised states to use the money they've received from the federal government to pay people $100 for each person who gets vaccinated. He also announced that he would direct his agencies to reimburse businesses who provide paid time off to their employees to get vaccinated. He also announced new restrictions on federal workers, namely that they will either have to get vaccinated or mask up with weekly testing. So far, the move has angered some, and the federal workers' unions have raised concerns about the dangers of requiring people to reveal their vaccination status. The concern is that such a policy could harm the privacy rights of employees. However, the Biden administration appears inclined to protect those rights and records from being leaked, at least so far. What matters here is who Biden blamed for the rising Delta variant, the unvaccinated. So far, almost half of the American population is fully vaccinated. However, in order to reach herd immunity, we need to get that number to around 70%. And unfortunately, we are not close yet. So far, the Biden administration is making a clear point that needs to be repeated over and over again. Vaccination is the only way to get out of this mess that we are in now. Those who refuse to vaccinate are harming our country and are causing undue burdens on the rest of our society. But if we are to be serious about this, we need to incentivize vaccination as much as possible. Companies, government agencies, and anyone else we can use should be pushing vaccination until we get to herd immunity. It's for the good of the country, and there's no other option. Day 1 of the January 6th Select Committee began on Tuesday, and it was already emotional. 4 officers who defended the Capitol testified about their brutal experiences. Their names are Sergeant Connell, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department Officer Fanon, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department Officer Hodges, and U.S. Capitol Police Officer Dunn. During their testimony, all 4 officers outlined the brutality of that horrible day that nearly ended an election. During the hearing, officers Fanon, Dunn, and Connell expressed frustration with the lackluster response, the hatred that remained unpunished, and the unwillingness of some members of Congress to face reality. In particular, Fanon directly condemned members of Congress who refused to acknowledge the seriousness of the riot. Meanwhile, Officer Dunn noted that he had been subjected to racial slurs for voting for Joe Biden. Officer Connell also noted that he thought he was going to die as he was nearly being strangled by the rioters. The reason I mention this is because a lot of people are going to make this seem like a political hit job against Trump, but for these officers, it wasn't that. It was hell for them. Hell that they are still recovering from. and there are a lot of people who are more than willing to hide their contributions to that trauma. Just recently, Jim Jordan confessed that he had talked to Trump on the same day as the riots, meaning he is a material witness to the committee's investigation. He has a vested interest in downplaying and denying the importance of this investigation, and Minority Leader McCarthy tried to give him a seat in that very same investigation. The fact is that for the next few weeks, these Republicans will obstruct as much as they can to hide the consequences of their rhetoric, which they spewed months after the election was over. If the current state of things is anything to go by, you can be sure that Republicans aren't going to be playing fair, much less listening to what these officers are actually saying. But you most certainly should. That's all for this week's episode. Thank you all for joining me. If you enjoyed the episode, feel free to share it on Twitter and any other social media outlets that you want. It helps the podcast grow, and I really appreciate it. If you want to see more content outside of the podcast, consider checking out the newsletter on Substack. Just look up The Progressive American and Substack, and you will find me there. I will be off for the next week, but I'll be back the week afterward if all goes according to plan. Thanks again for watching, and I look forward to hearing from you again.